A priest, a crusader knight, and a vampire hunter walk into a bar. The bartender says, "Ah, my friend the cleric, are you back seeking spirits?" Bad joke aside, this illustrates one of my two big problems with the old school D&D cleric, and that's that it's so archetypically specific that it doesn't cover any particular archetype well. This cleric wears heavy armor, only uses blunt weapons, casts spells ranging from healing to finding traps, memorizes spells every morning, has Christian trappings, and repels undead with their faith. That's a very specific archetype that only represents itself. I don't believe there's any character in any piece of fiction before D&D that would be accurately represented by the classic cleric. You could try to specifically make a priest, but what priest wears knightly armor, only uses blunt weapons, and has to memorize spells in the morning to access divine power? You could try to specifically make a crusader knight, but what crusader knight would be caught without a sword? What crusader knight casts spells and specifically causes the undead to flee? You could try to specifically make a vampire hunter, but what vampire hunter wears heavy armor, only uses blunt weapons, and casts spells like Cure Light Wounds? It's ultimately so specific that it pigeonholes players into a very specific kind of religious warrior that doesn't feel the most organic. That's my issue with the classic cleric's theme. I also have an issue with its mechanical role. First, I think their barren first level is an issue. Old school D&D is much more deadly than modern D&D, and it's much more common to return to first level upon death. Obviously, this varies by DM to DM, but it seems to me that it's generally the case that players spend quite a bit of time at first level. Unfortunately, clerics don't get spells at first level, so you're basically a worse fighter who is situationally clutch if you encounter undead. But that's where Turn Undead comes in, and it's probably my biggest gripe about this class. Turn Undead is very strong against undead, and it scales in a way that a high level cleric can automatically demolish a dozen skeletons at a time, when their fighter ally is still making one single attack, just more accurately than he used to. I think the inevitable result of this is that when you face undead, clerics are far more necessary than they should be, and when you don't face undead, one of their largest features is completely invalidated. That's not just an issue for the party, that's an issue for the DM. When you're designing encounters, adventures, dungeons, or whatever, you know whether or not you have a cleric. You know that a bunch of undead could TPK a party without a cleric, or that those same undead could be absolutely crushed by a party with a cleric. I don't like having so much of my thumb on the scale. I'd rather eliminate that bit of bias as much as possible. Now, this is my reaction to the old school cleric as a former 5e DM. I haven't had the most experience with clerics, so my perspective could definitely change. So far, though, they just really don't appeal to me, either in terms of the first level experience they give players, the awkward world building quirks they give, or how heavily they influence monster selection. So, the cleric doesn't appeal to me. What's the alternative? I could just cut it out, or I could just play a game that specifically cuts it out for me. The blogger D&D Delta has a set of house rules for OD&D that cut the cleric out, and he has a number of great articles about that I'll link down below. The OD&D retro clone Seven Voyages to Xylarthan also cuts clerics out. So what do you lose if you cut the cleric? Well, the elf is classically a warrior mage hybrid class, so you don't miss that broad spellsword archetype. You don't need a religious warrior class to be a religious warrior. I could easily see a fighter joining a religious order, going on a quest for them, and obtaining a holy sword that grants them some form of holy magic. Clerics specifically have spells that are useful for the overall party, like healing and finding traps, but these can be folded into the magic user class if you determine them necessary. And as for undead, I think you could either just use less undead or just keep the undead terrifying. Honestly, I think the undead should be terrifying. It's honestly rather lame to have reanimated corpses running in terror of some guy holding up a holy symbol. I will say, though, that I do think the game would be incomplete without a wisdom based class, and in old school D&D, wisdom is basically the cleric stat. Because of that, I think it's worth considering alternatives to the classic cleric. One idea is to have elves take the role of clerics as the wisdom based spellsword class. You could have them use dexterity and wisdom as prime requisites rather than strength and intelligence. This would definitely give a strong wood elf vibe, which may not be desirable if you prefer that high elf vibe. Another idea is to scrap the martial aspects of the cleric and replace it with what is basically a wisdom based magic user who uses the cleric spell list, but starts with a spell at first level just like a magic user and advances similarly. You could add some subtle differences, like having this alternative cleric advance at the fast rate of default clerics rather than the slow rate of default magic users. And you could maybe even have them use spontaneous casting rather than Vancian casting. There are other wackier ideas out there, such as replacing clerics with Friar Tuck style monks or magic sword wielding legally distinct Jedi. It really just comes down to what elements of the cleric you want to keep in the game and what flavor you want your religious class to have, if you even want one. But anyway, these are just my opinions. If you disagree or have any kind of comment, please let me know. As always, thank you for watching and have a good day. Goodbye.